Hey folks, this is Soren from Framecarver, and today I'm going to give you a tour of my new plugin for After Effects called Grainiac. Grainiac is a 32-bit color, high dynamic range film grain plugin that uses your GPU to speed up render times, and it's designed to be completely parametric. So all the controls that I've given you in this plugin have some basis in physical reality. You're going to find there's a lot of stuff to like about it compared to a lot of the other grain plugins that are out there, and I hope that it's not only useful, but it's fun to play with. Alright, here we are in After Effects. I've got some test footage that was shot on a Sony Venice 2. You can see here in the project panel, the color space it was shot in is S-Log3. And if we look at my project settings, you can see we're in 32 bits per channel with the OCIO color engine, and then the working space is set to ACCG. And as I hover over the image here, you can see the dark parts of this image here up in the info panel. Our RGB values are around 0.03, and then as I mouse over these highlights, we actually go over 1. We're like over 6 in the red channel there. Over here we're above 7 in all 3 channels, so this is pretty bright. And this is pretty typical for like working with log footage in linear space. You want to be able to play with the full range of color that you have in your footage, and be able to dial things in without losing anything. Now, maybe you've made a clean plate to integrate something and you're applying grain back on top to kind of finish it out. And if you apply the stock add grain effect, which ships with After Effects, you'll notice that we lose all of the highlights. And if I set this to full final output, we'll get rid of this little preview box. So you can see it's applied grain, but all of our highlights are now being clipped to 1 if you look up in the info panel there. So this is not great. And the reason this happens is because if you click on this yellow triangle here, this effect only supports 8 and 16-bit per channel color. Using this effect in a 32-bit per channel project may remove any high dynamic range values. And this is kind of what drove me to create Grainiac. So if we go to Effect, Framecarver, Grainiac, you'll see right away it's applying grain, but we're keeping those highlights that are above 1. And I have a few different presets here. This one uses a film blend mode, which naturally darkens the image as real film grain would. So you'll notice as I toggle this on and off, the overall image exposure seems to drop a little bit. If you're working on a VFX comp and you're really wanting to preserve the luminance, I would switch to the balanced blend mode. And so if I toggle this on and off, you'll see it's perfectly preserving your original exposure, and your grain is just kind of balanced in the middle. So it's not lightening, it's not darkening. There you go. Grainiac ships with a ton of different controls. My intent was to kind of expose a lot of different things so you have complete control over the look and feel of the grain. The main goal is to be able to give you a lifelike film grain that works with whatever footage you've got. I also built Grainiac to render really quickly. So you'll notice if I RAM preview this, we'll be able to get 24 4K frames in just a few seconds here. There we go. And we can see the render time on that layer is about 326 milliseconds per frame. Now, if I were to go back to the stock add grain, you'll notice it's almost twice as slow. So if I do a RAM preview here again, takes a significantly longer time to get that preview fully cached. And we're losing the highlights too. So not great. But yeah, Grainiac will use your GPU, and it supports multi-frame rendering. So you should have much quicker results depending on the size of your footage, of course. So now to kind of walk you through all of the controls here. At the top we've got working color space, and this is set to auto by default. And so you can see right here, it's automatically detected my project's working color space, which is using ACCG, which is a linear color space. And the reason we have this is so that we can make sure all of the grain math is happening in linear color space, regardless of what your project color space is set to. So this is not detecting your footage's color space. And here we have a list of presets. So you've got the standard kind of negative grain, which darkens the image slightly. We've got a really subtle one that probably won't be visible on YouTube. It's typical kind of slide reversal film, classic monochrome, and stylistic gritty grain where it's mostly in the shadows there. And I've got some more creative presets to kind of push towards more interesting looks outside of just being film grain. We've got a few interesting options there. And then I've got a few crazy presets that just kind of showcase how far you can push the plugin towards stuff that doesn't really match reality, but might be useful if you're making a music video or stylistic poster or something and you want a still frame. I've shipped the plugin with 6 different film types. Now these, if I swap through these with this preset, you'll see kind of change some of the base properties of the grain in subtle ways, maybe some not so subtle ways. And so these are kind of your big knobs for getting different grain looks. And then after the film type, we have all of the controls for the grain itself, which I'll go through next. And I think it would actually be easier to show how some of these controls work using a solid black and white gradient. So I'm going to convert that so we can get kind of the more perceptual gradient from 0. And let's see, the highlights kind of go over, yeah, they're up to like 12 at the very bottom here. So if I apply Grainiac, and then let's push the intensity up. I'm going to dial the crystal size way up so we can see some of the individual crystals, and then I'm going to dial the density way down, get a better sense of what's happening here. So intensity controls, well, the intensity of the grain. The higher the number, the more grain. Crystal size, pretty self-explanatory, allows you to adjust the size of the grain anywhere from like microscopic to these big clumps. Crystal density will keep the size of the grain crystals the same, but just the space between them. Crystal size variation allows you to add some randomness to the size of the crystals, so they're not all kind of uniform. Crystal shape, if we dial it back to 0, all of our crystals turn into these circles. And as we dial it up to 100, they take on these more irregular shapes, and we can even push it past 100 to get some even more exaggerated crystals. This is also something that is affected by film type. So if I switch to the print film type, we're seeing a bit more of these elongated crystal shapes. So as I push to 300 here, we get almost these like lines of grain, which if we increase the density, kind of have their own unique look here. So I'm going to switch back to this one. Crystal clumping. This basically adjusts groups of crystals so that they appear less uniform. This is really noticeable, smaller sizes too. You can see it just kind of makes it look a little more organic. Aspect ratio allows you to stretch those crystals either horizontally or vertically. All right, moving on to emulsion development. Emulsion model kind of emulates this sort of spotty or cloudy defect that can happen when developing film. You can see it's kind of adding a little bit of a secondary noise layer across the grain that adjusts sort of the intensity in different patches. Dye cloud spread, you can almost think of it as like softness, just controlling how sharp each of those dye spots look. And then CMY Crosstalk is cyan, magenta, yellow color bleed between the different emulsion layers. If I dial this down, there's no crosstalk at all, and then as I dial this up, you can see the colors kind of bleeding together, and we're seeing kind of more of this muddy color. All right, moving on to exposure response. Base fog is sort of the undeveloped part of your image, and how much tint it gets from the chemical base. So as we crank this up, you can see our shadows are picking up a little bit more of a tint there. And then there's luminosity-driven grain size, which ties the grain size to the luminosity of the part of the image that it's being applied to. So as we crank up luminosity coupling, what we see is the grain in the shadows gets bigger and the grain in the highlights gets finer. So if we look at our gradient example here, if we crank luminosity coupling down to 0, everything's pretty uniform. And then as we push this up, suddenly we're getting this gradient in size across shadows to highlights. Okay, so that's the main control groups for the grain itself. Everything below exposure response, we've got halation, edge enhancement, tonal range, color. These should be pretty self-explanatory. I would just invite you to go in and kind of play around with these, and I will have full documentation on my website if you need it, but for the sake of this quick kind of little tour, I covered kind of the big knobs that you need to be aware of and how to use them. So feel free to leave comments though, and let me know if there's anything that you're confused or unclear about, and I'm happy to answer questions. I hope that you guys love this plugin and find some use in it. So yeah, please email me, leave some comments. I'm here for you guys. All right, until next time.